welcome, using applause of some kind, Bridget Cogley to speak to us about color in vizzes. Go ahead, Bridget.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming me here. It's nice to not do the 6 or more hour drive, so I am presenting from Columbus, Ohio. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and get right on our presentation today. So part of the motivation for this talk really comes from a history of the story that color is hard. So typically when I walk around and talk with people, the story I always get is, color is really difficult. It can make or break your viz. And a lot of people struggle with it. I did myself for a number of years as well. The other question I frequently get is, how do we incorporate brand colors? So you're working for a place, you want that dashboard to really feel like it came from your workspace. And so you want to make sure that you're branding it as well. And so that's kind of part 2 of this. The other part is looking at accessibility and really making sure that we're designing with accessibility in mind from the start. And lastly is building a process. So that's kind of what this talk is today. It's really trying to demystify that color is hard. And so what this means is that ideally we get to something kind of like this, where you can see that color is used. It's used very meaningfully, but it's not overdone. And so that's kind of some of the goal of what today is. So tip number 1 to get to something like this is what I call Stroopifying. And what this does is it harkens back to this really fun experiment. And I love to pick on somebody. So who wants to be my volunteer to say the color, not the word? So this is excellent. Nick, you're on.
Say the color, not the word. So
say the color, not the word.
Red, blue, green, yellow, green, black. This hurts. Blue, red, yellow, black, yellow, blue, green, red, black.
And so yes, so that is the Stroop effect. And the reason that's hard is because these colors have semantic meaning, and I have purposely broken the rule. So purple should have been purple colored and so forth. So that gives you an idea of the Stroop effect. And we do this a lot of times without realizing it. So here's an example of a public visualization I did. I have changed the colors a bit, and so with many of us home with the pandemic, a lot more of us are probably in the kitchen than have ever been, myself included. And so when I think about things like garlic or coriander being blue, it kind of hurts my head. When I think about things like fennel and fenugreek, really, being orange, that doesn't fit. And so that is also another example of the Stroop effect. And so you can see here I've got an example where it's matching exactly. So now I've taken all the colors of my spices and I've really tried to match them exactly. So this has great meaning. From a color standpoint, it's a little bit overwhelming, and this may or may not be sustainable long term, particularly if I add a bunch more spices, which I have in my cabinet. So this is kind of that artistic rounding. So I've got, 5 colors at max, and what I've done is I've kind of picked the ones most like that other item. So you can see that this still works. And what this allows us to do is, as we explore by flavor palette, so, savory spices versus hot and spicy versus what I consider your dessert spices, a pattern starts to emerge that we both expect and can understand because we've applied Stroop. Now, the one thing about this is that there is still a personal element. You may look at this and say, no, black pepper just cannot be brown. Or you might look at some of the other ones and just say, I don't fully agree with you. But all of this is relying on that Stroop effect. And for the most part, we're going to fairly well align. I am not the only one fascinated by this. So what's really neat to me is that Tableau themselves have also played with this. So this is an experiment done by Vidya Settler and Maureen Stone. Yes, that Maureen Stone. Just playing with, here's what Tableau does by default. So you've got broccoli as blue, you've got carrots as brown, you've got corn as green, and you've got some other things in there such as pink tomatoes. Not anything I'm interested in eating. Then you've got this algorithmically created version where they went through on Google, sorted out all these images, pulled in what they felt were the most reasonable colors, and they make a lot more sense as you and I look at them. The iceberg lettuce still doesn't look that appetizing to me, but that's typically the case anyway. So what this means is we can then take this and apply this to concepts. So one of the stories I get told when I go places is that red universally means bad, stop, love, and passion. And sometimes people will strongly stand on this. It's not one strong stance I'm going to make. I will say that it sometimes means these things. And so these are abstractions, and the best part about these is you play with them enough, they can be retrained. So if I want to make passion purple, if I want to say, you know what, the new color of love is green, and I market it, Pantone does a great job at this, and we've seen this in the past before with one of my favorite concepts out there, clean. You know, you go back to the 1920s, it's clean like sunshine. And so you've got Arm & Hammer, you know, and their packaging is still in that yellow color. Whereas you and I look at this and kind of go, maybe not. For a period of time, white became the color of clean. And so you look at things like Clorox bleach, where you can actually see the intermarrying of where white started to move to blue. So you've got blue, clean like water. And then finally, all of a sudden, you know, out of kind of this natural movement, green somehow became clean. And so these are kind of the ways that we play with Stroop, is that we begin building semantic associations with color. This is really fun to use in data visualization, and it's a fact I've used quite frequently to help people understand and navigate through these dashboards. So this is kind of an experiment I did, and I've done this multiple times out in public, and it really took off. And one of the reasons that this works is because there's a hidden Stroop effect that I don't advertise, but long-term you actually build a sense for. And that is that I've got sales in a gray palette, I've got amount in kind of a pinky red, and then I've got profit in purple. These are not traditional colors, but these are ways of being able to pull in a brand, build semantic associations, and really start working towards the analysis I want. So you have a lot less legends. This is another example where using Stroop to drive action. So depending on the type of campaign drive I'm doing, I've got name sponsorships versus subscriptions. And so depending on the item that you click, so here I've got subscription highlighted. And so if I'm in a call center and calling to get donations, I've got yellow in front of me, and that will cue long-term that, okay, I'm going to use this script versus I've got named sponsorships. These are a much higher dollar amount. My script may be totally different. And if I land on this as a potential client, or I do a lookup and find this person, I'm going to use a very different script. So this is how you can also use Stroop to drive action. So here's tip number 2, and tip number 2 is that perception is not universal. And I'm sure throughout this talk, some people are going, but what about, colorblindness? What about this? And so I want to really address this perception and universals. And this also feeds into the fact that accessibility matters from the start. And so without further ado, I present you one of my favorite experiments that occurred out in the wild. What color is this dress? And I love doing this live because sometimes I'll actually get to where I can poll people. So, I mean, if you want to use reactions and say, okay, applause is white and gold, and maybe a smiley face is black and blue, feel free, and we can anecdotally collect the results. So I'll give that a second. And then I'm going to jump into where they've done this in labs, they've done this through research. Typically what you find is roughly about 57% of people will say that the dress is black and blue. Another 30% will say, no, it's solidly white and gold. I'm very much in the white and gold camp. And then 13% see something totally different. Here's the fun fact with this. Gender, age, and even your brain activity all play a role into why this is the way it is. And so this was, to me, one of the coolest things. So even if we don't take colorblindness into account, we all don't see the same thing. This is another example of where we've got, you know, different color artifacts that make it harder to see what we're seeing. And so this is an example where we're perhaps comparing color. We've got this task of this lighter blue, this darker blue, and what we're trying to do is look at those middle rectangles and figure out, you know, are they the same color? Are they the different color? Surprise, surprise, we have now found the Chubb illusion. So in addition to making my own Pokemon character, I now have a Chubb illusion. And so what we can see is that depending on what color, what surrounding color is around, it affects what we see as color. It affects the types of comparisons we can appropriately do. And this happens in charts. And so I get a lot of engagements where people really want to make these. And I really strongly push against them because it's extraordinarily difficult to use color in this instance as a clue. And there are 3 identical matches in this chart collection, 3. And if you ask me, I cannot find them even though I made this. Because as I look through here, the ones I would tell you that look similar to me are not in any way, shape, or form the ones that are actually the identical ones. And sometimes people say, well, it's diverging, that's a little deceptive. Here is the same version, same numbers, but it's just a continuous scale. And so I challenge you to find the ones that are identical. I'll go ahead and cheat a little bit, and you can actually see particularly A and Q, and I had to draw the lines there, and even with the line drawn, my brain cannot overcome these 2 are the same. It keeps looking at it and going, no, they're different. So even with particularly that top A and Q, I don't see them as the same. And so that's a really neat thing when we test this out in the public. A lot of people struggle with this. So color is not the best cueing item out there because it is very deceptive. Some other ways we can play with color. This one is extraordinarily painful to me, so I'm only going to leave it up for a short time. If that looks like it's scintillating, that's part of the illusion. And so we can also do this when we build out charts, you know, particularly scatter plots. We've got the grid perhaps a little more forward. It becomes very hard to see. Sometimes I get these cases, I beg for people to make it lighter. I get people who make it lighter and bolder, and then I almost have that same scintillating grid effect. It also makes it extraordinarily hard to see the data. And so typically when I make these kinds of charts, I really try to push that grid back. I may even also preserve the color. And so you can actually see those lines have a slight yellow hue to them just to kind of preserve that color and keep it more back than forward. One of the other stories that I get told a lot is we notice bright colors. And so it's like you definitely see that bright green, you probably see that red as well. Those items stand out. Now, the challenge to this is that do we notice bright colors or do we notice difference? And so here's that exact same picture. I've got black in there, I've got white in there. I actually also have a couple other hidden treats in there. And so anybody looking at this saying, well, there's more than that, yes, you're correct. Because what we actually notice is relational contrast. So I've got an extraordinarily bright color. That's not necessarily the thing you notice because everything is bright. So therefore the things that stand out, perhaps annoy you, are these random black shapes I'd have down at the bottom, some of the white, and you probably even see the pink and go, why? This funnels into accessibility and also thinking about contrast and how we make things accessible or not accessible. So you can see some of those darker tones, it's really hard to discern. Some of those higher intensities start reaching a pain threshold. Hello?
Everyone, please be sure to mute yourself. If you're not already.
So when we start thinking about web content and accessibility guidelines, we want to make sure that we're providing the appropriate amount of contrast.
Alyssa, if you're in earshot, could you give me co-host privileges?
And so typically what web content does is it evaluates for readable text. And so you're looking for a contrast ratio of either 7:1 or 4.5 to 1, just to get that readable text as well. So that's kind of an example of that lighter to darker ratio. And so this is kind of where you can see that example with an accessible color. So you can actually test this, and I strongly encourage as you're designing to do so. So this is an example of AA compliance. So you can see here's that gray on gray. It gives me some recommendations of either you can lighten the text, you can darken the background. If I move that to AAA, you can see how much more contrast I have to put in. So the AA was really, really light. It wasn't a huge change in my design. That AAA definitely requires a high amount of contrast, and it's really good to make sure that your text at the very minimum reaches that kind of capability. So the primary takeaway from this is really understanding that color is relative to the surrounding, the size, as well as the position. So here is tip 3. And this is a fun one. So it's complementary color magic. And what I really like about this is, when we hear complementary colors, it really goes to the idea of completing, or the Latin complio. So just taking a color, whether it's violet to yellow, and it goes down to the middle of brown. You can also see the same thing happens with red and green, and finally blue and orange. So these are opposites on the color wheel. So you can kind of see on the color wheel where blue and orange diverge, where purple and yellow, and also red and green. So those are what you call complementary colors. Now, the fun part with these is they have a magic trick that they do. It's one of the reasons we always see them in comic books, because as you look through this, some of this is hard to read. Some of these actually pop off the page. And that popping off the page is a really fun effect called chromostereopsis. And so as you try to read this, it looks like it has actually popped off, like I've applied a shadow in the background. This is extraordinarily painful. So particularly for somebody like me, that red glows, the blue glows, and then trying to read it is absolutely impossible. So for anyone who wants to see, I've now changed the color. There was never any shadow behind that in the first place, but that is your color complementary magic of chromostereopsis. And the best part is I've seen it in the wild. So when Marion put this out on Twitter, I about jumped for joy, because especially when you look at that kind of on the gray, you can see some of those colors pop around and move. And if you really stare at it long enough, and particularly in that nice cropping, it was really apparent. But in particular, that red and also some of the blues start to kind of bounce and move around. So that is your complementary color magic. Tip number 4 is really on how do you reduce complexity. So this is where a lot of people are like, well, I've got, red, gold, and green, and I call those kind of karma chameleon colors, where you get forced to use them. And some of this comes from the story or the myth that stoplight colors are intuitive for stop, slow, and go. And then we end up with critters like these, where everyone's like, it must be. And I know I go into a lot of engagements, it must be. And so you try to have the colorblind conversation and show people that this is exactly what this looks like. And so that it is horribly inaccessible to a fair number of people. And so sometimes we do other things, and we really talk about, like, how is it that we see? And so when you think about stumbling around in the dark at night and tripping on things, and you can kind of make out the different parts of your room, it's because of the rods in your eyes. You're able to stumble around and have a bit of night vision because you have rods. The fun part is we've also got cones. And so those are what allow us to see the world in color. So you've got blue cones, green, and then also red. And you'll notice that they fall on different wavelengths of light. And red is the one that we can see the farthest. It's one of the reasons we started using it for traffic signals. White kind of encompasses the whole span of color. And so that's the other color that we can see the farthest. And so this is a photo that captivates us in part because it's not natural. This is not how we see it all. So when we typically look at this photo, it's a little bit more grade scaled when we look at it in real life. So that's kind of what that looks like. So part of what happened with the traffic light is that distance really created that myth. We needed to see far away at night. Red shines the farthest, white shines the second farthest, but you can't use it when you've got a lot of starlight. So therefore, green is the next farthest color you can show. It is not colorblind friendly. But one of the challenges with the traffic light signals, we forgot a couple of things. Number one, we forgot that only one signal displays at a time. And so a lot of times people are like, we must use traffic lights. But then what we forget is that you typically only ever see one when you're going and making that decision. The other thing we forget is how much work we put into blinding anyone who doesn't need to see that signal. And so that's the other piece, is that we're used to one channel at a time, but then also really making sure that only the people who need to see that signal see the signal. And so when we revisit this dashboard and think about, okay, we only want one signal on at a time, that helps us make better decisions about the design of this. It really helps us simplify it and start focusing on boosting the signal we want to send. And so the signal I want to send is I don't want patients to readmit to my hospital in this visualization. And so anything that has to do with readmission, I'm going to highlight. And so some of the key ideas and the best way to get rid of red, gold, and green is to design only in grayscale. If you're looking at trying to show good and bad, pick one or the other. And that's really hard. And designing in black and white really forces that shift in thinking, because we're really used to, we got to see it all. And unfortunately, as we see it all, it really makes it hard to make a decision. You end up with analysis paralysis. And so when we add color last, we really get that unichannel focus on what we need to accomplish. Best part is this also supports the guidance that we have. So when we think about accessibility, if I'm only sending one signal, as long as I see a color, as long as I see contrast, I can make this out. So that's one way to also incorporate accessibility right from the start. Best part is this leads into some of our branding conversations in a little bit. It allows me to put in those corporate colors. So if I'm working with a hospital and they've decided their color is pink, you bet I can put that in here. So what happens when we need to throw multiple colors in here? And that's where we get struggles sometimes, is how do we find the signal when we've got multiple colors? Another key idea, though, as we start bringing colors in, is avoiding semantic overlap. And I'll show you what I mean by that here in a second. But we want to make sure we're cueing with as many other attributes as possible, and not only color. So here's an example of an analysis I did. So this is real temperature data from my house taken during the dead of winter. So Columbus, Ohio, we get very cold here. I want to be warm. And so what I did here is I wanted to highlight, where do I work that day? I wanted to understand where my readings were, what my room would be like as I begin thinking about where I want to work. You already know the answer, I think. But you can see where my master bedroom at that time was the warmest room, and then my office at a 65, maybe even 66 degrees is not a very warm place for me, particularly during the winter. Now, as I go through this and I look at this without color, the first two items, when I look at kind of the median temperature by room and the temps by day, I don't necessarily need color to cue me through that. Where I start to struggle is that second half, where I start looking at time of day, the outer bands, and then I get to the scatter plot, which is just a ball of gray. So it is total confusion. And so that's how we start throwing in color. And so you can see here, this is one experiment where I said, okay, well, I want to cue that overnight, it's dark. So, and then evening slightly darker, and then day gets to be this brighter color, and then I've got these two, I've got a really kind of hard to see red, and then I've also got a very light blue for my cooler temperature. So I'm trying to use color semantically. One problem with this, though, I don't like how much blue I have that seems to be the same. So is my blue for evening? Is my blue for cold? And so I really didn't like that version. And I also wasn't a fan of the color ramping. As I look at day and evening, if I put any type of color blindness or lack of color on it, those two items will have really bad discernment. And so I actually settled on a version like this. And what this allowed me to do was have the appropriate color ramping. So my overnight was still kind of that more navy blue. I made my evening a little bit more with the gray, and I ended up keeping more of that yellow for day. This allowed me to bring up my red. This allowed me to bring up that kind of brighter blue. And so now I don't have semantic overlap on this analysis. Now I can very clearly begin to understand here are hot things, here are cold things. I am definitely relying on a Stroop effect for that to work. And then also I'm explicitly telling you I'm banding these colors this way. And you notice I don't have to have a legend, because as you hover and interact with this, you begin to discover that overnight ties right back to that overnight color.
Bridget,
Mhm.
we've had a number of questions come in, but one that's relevant right in this moment is if you could briefly describe what color ramping is. If you could
Perfect.
explain
So
that.
color ramping is kind of, think of it as how do you want to diverge. And so some of my color ramping is moving from concept to concept. And so, for example, there is a semantic relationship between day, evening, and overnight. And so what I want to do is preserve that relationship, that there is, here's day, and I think of day like this. Here's evening, I think of evening as, a time with less light, and then overnight has far less light, ideally. So that's kind of that color ramping. And I wanted to make sure that there was a good balance between the colors so that one wasn't overly dominating the other.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. So colorblindness, I just want to touch briefly on this. So as you start designing these are things to keep in mind. And there's a number of places to go to test your colorblindness accessibility. I'll kind of cover a couple of those. But the other one too is really this accessiblecolors.com. So as you start thinking in particular about text, and your attributes, this accessiblecolors.com really gives you a way to test your background. I put a lot of backgrounds in my visualizations. And so what this does is you can kind of see, okay, is there enough contrast? Particularly with text, I really aim for that AAA rating. If people have to read it and be on the hook for it, I want to make it as accessible as possible. The other thing is taking into account things like neurological differences, just understanding different brains either get excited by different things or see things different ways. Certain levels of striping and things will really give your migraine sufferers a massive headache, unfortunately. So there are actually certain patterns that induce migraines. And then there's, Mozilla's got a number of resources that really help think about, okay, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. So the other part with accessibility is when you're working with somebody and you're aiming to make certain things accessible for a known person, ask them, test them, but then also just remember that whomever is requesting any kind of accommodation, that person's going to be the expert. They know what they need, they know what works and what doesn't work. So here is tip 5, and that is get that brand incorporated. So we've gone through a number of different things. You can see that when you're designing in black and white, that's really going to change how you design, but it also means it's much, much, much easier to put that brand color in. And so here's an example of a brand I kind of pulled off the internet. So they've got these different things, and I'm seeing more and more brands like this where they have kind of this unichromatic color, it's all in blue, or it's all, primarily this color. And I'm getting a lot more of these where it's, the one color choices. And so here's what I could potentially do with it from a visualization. And as I look at this, and I'm going to go back to that kind of color ramping idea where when I look at some of the blues, when I look at, my other choices between white and gray, some of these don't stand out well. So what I can see here is that bright blue really stands out, the white really stands out, the gray falls behind, and then that dark blue just really doesn't stand out at all. So they're pretty, but they're not really functional. So what I want to do here, this is the terrifying part. And I actually gave this presentation with my CMO on the line. And he was actually quite content and happy about it, which surprised me, because usually when you get CMOs on the line, they're very protective of their brand, and you explain, no, I need to increase discernment. So I need a way for those colors to stand out and pop a bit more. And the best part is a lot of people tell me color is hard. I don't get color theory. I don't know what works well. it's all math. So you come in here, you pick your degrees. So 45, 90, these are common degrees. The best part is Peloton will even give you recommendations to start with. So if you really don't know, you're not sure, you can definitely stick with what the default that Peloton recommends. And the nice part is they give you, here's, 3 like colors, here's 3, juxtaposed bar against each other. So you can really see that and play with that. And just like with anything mathematical, there are definitely certain magical numbers that we prefer, 45, 60, 90. These are all nice relationships typically. So this is a way to get those kind of like colors. The other thing you'll notice is that they're all now equally bright. So even though my design on this probably isn't as fun as some of the others I've got out there, this gives you an idea of where these colors now kind of match at the very least. So I'm still pulling in the brand, I'm adding in some color for functionality and for easier discernment. And so even if somebody is colorblind, they will be able to pick these out. They will be able to see which ones are different. So that's the other thing. And key is with this to go in and test. One of the other things I'm running into more and more when I deal with brands is that they have no opposite colors. So when we think about showing positive and negative, or we want some of those compare and contrast data points, I absolutely need something on the opposite side of that spectrum. Peloton also offers an option here. So you can see here where I'm really picking kind of that 90-degree relationship, and I'm really making sure that I have a very clear opposite or complement to my primary color. So that way I've got now a new orange to throw into my data set. And so as I start visualizing things and I want to show positive and negative, now I can. And you'll also notice I'm really trying to avoid any kind of overlap. So once I've used the blue, I don't want to reuse it. If I've got data that doesn't necessarily have a colored component, you see I've picked a very neutral color, I've let it be backwards. And this just allows me to use color, again, without it being overwhelming, without it overlapping, and to reduce confusion. And so this is still a branded product as well. And then this is definitely on the outer edge of branding as well. Most people are going to either go with white backgrounds or black backgrounds. Some of my work, I intentionally experiment with weird colors. So trickiest part with the branding is, yes, you're going to add colors. I have yet to work with a brand where I haven't added colors. I typically add colors just because either the ramping or kind of the relationships between the color aren't very nice. They're not colorblind friendly. So I will definitely go in and throw, and when I'm looking at things like categorical data, so this is where I've made a bar chart, I've got maybe 3 or 4 options, and I really want to call these out for some reason, that's where I'm going to say, okay, adjacent, triad, tetrad, those are some of the options I'm going to pick to get that categorical data. With diverging, I'm going to definitely make sure I've got a 180-degree opposite. And then the best part with Peloton, you see it down at the bottom, I've got a vision simulator. I've got where I can actually export this out to the hex codes I need to pop it in Tableau as a custom color palette. This is, to me, one of the wonder tools out there. So that's, to me, one of the powers of color. And so you can see where this allows you to start looking at brands and then bringing in these brands into your visualization. So you can see Columbus Zoo, kind of how I took their brand assets, I took color, and I really tried to bring it in to make a cohesive experience. This is a client of mine, it's probably my most famous client. And you see here that they've really only got kind of this two-tone. They've got blue and they've got green. They've got a couple shades of blue, but what do you think I used as an opposite? And it's not the color you would expect. And so when I started bringing their data in, I treated that blue as the base and my green became my highlight color. So in my visual language I created for them, green was highlight, blue was kind of everything else. And then I brought in purple to get that contrast I needed. So anything positive was green, anything negative was purple. And then this is another client. So this is actually, DataRobot. This is predictive analysis. So you saw this at the beginning. And now you can kind of see all the tricks baked into this where, I've got a lot of data shape. So you can see over on the right-hand side, most of it really is just using shape to cue. And then the one highlight color with a tangible action. So now, if I'm looking up a client with this, I can actually see, oh, my next offer is this. So I'm using color to cue that. And then two, even if somebody can't see the difference between red and yellow, I'm making sure I'm building in those accessibility options with also keeping in those labels. So that's kind of to recap this. I know this was a lot. So really kind of the 5 tips are just to stroopify, to cue beyond color, to get it right in black and white, add any colors that you need, but also avoid that chromostereopsis. So that is the talk. And I know we have a lot of questions, so I will kind of defer off to kind of the QA section.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. This was high value. Like there's a ton of data. And I'm so glad we're recording because there was no way for me to keep up with keeping notes.
And don't feel like you've got to take notes. I've got a lot of this out on my blog as well.
Great.
So it's...
Bridget, this is
Go ahead,
this is Jim. I made a note in the chat about you had the map of the U.S. up there, and I mean it just popped off the page compared to what you would naturally get if you just use the Tableau default.
Mm-hmm.
This is almost like a two-part question. One, do you ever use the Tableau default? And I think I know the answer. And two, have you sat down and talked to the product manager about that's the map? Have you sat down and talked to them about, wow, how much better this is? Just my opinion.
So
than what we would get if we just defaulted to something.
The real funny thing is I mean, technically this is the default Tableau map. It's just I've taken every single layer of annotation off. And so this started initially as an obsession. I will actually share the visualization that really started me down that path. And it was this, are we speaking? And I wanted to build this world where the map was yellow. And I mean, it was very much, I wanted it to look a very specific way. So that was kind of how I came up with this, sorting this out. And I mean, it's a trick that Kelly Martin has done. I mean, this is definitely by no means a new trick, but it was just, to me, I wanted the focus to be on the data and not, the map is supplementary. The map is really there just to guide you and cue you that these things are in a certain space, in a certain spot in space. So I have talked with Tableau about it. They know my feelings on maps and the overburden of ink. But my biggest thing is, yes, I definitely try to strip it down to what's needed. You know, and then the nice part is tooltips will do the rest. So, I mean, if I don't know my states, which sometimes sadly I don't, tooltips will save me. So does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
So are there some other questions we had accumulate throughout the talk? Are there other websites like accessible-colors.com?
There are a number of websites. So, I mean, my websites are things like this Accessible Colors. There is the Peloton. There are a few where you can actually almost take an image. There's a Google extension where you can actually have the extension in and literally go through and scenario test. So, I mean, there are a number of tools, particularly for checking with colorblindness. I keep hoping for the day that Tableau just puts it natively in the system.
Cool. Let's see, there was some others. One I had, you had shown your Peloton of the different types, right? Like where you could triads and such. And then you showed it on a dark background. How do you go about choosing an appropriate background color after you've chosen your colors, or do you choose that along with your colors?
So a lot of times the brand decides the colors. So for example, this is, you know, real life example where, you know, they had wanted to make the dashboard in white, but the thing is they were using these for demos. They were showing these out on the big screen. And it's like, well, if this is a product, you want it in dark. And so this is kind of where we ended up. We had to kind of arm wrestle a bit. But, you know, when you're doing demos, you've got these things on a big screen, that green pops from a mile away. And the beauty is because I've down-tuned all the other colors. So you've got that dark blue in the background. You've got elements of black. That green really shows like a beacon.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of this is, you know, sadly years of experience. The other part of this is how we see color is dependent on the background itself. So this is an example of, I wanted to do a dashboard of the future. And when you watch any type of sci-fi film, they're always on glass. And you know, they always have this like thing in the middle, and they're always like hugely abstracted. And this thing has a ton of color. I do not normally put this much color in my work. And so one of the things I wanted to do, you know, and I did this, and, you know, it really worked. And, you know, when I tried it on white, when I tried it on a lighter background, I had to change the colors because it was overwhelming. And so you can see the difference where I've got a very bright white, and just this red here was almost harsh, and even this yellow is really not pretty. And if I were really, you know, to leave it like this, I would probably tune that more to brown. So how we see color against its background is huge.
And
I
when
mean,
you
you definitely want to test.
when you down tune, what are the toggles? What are the switches you typically flip? Do you just reduce saturation? Do you eyeball it like down a spectrum, make it a little darker?
So this is actually an entirely different color. So that is not even down tuned. So sometimes I try transparency. If that doesn't work, I really will go through and change the colors. Now, again, some of this is years of experience, and, you know, I've got a natural sense. So let me see if I can do this real quick. So you can see the artwork behind me. And so this is an example of, you know, color theory at play. So those are mine. And particularly the middle one, I took a picture of it one time. I ran it through this color tool, and I could actually see it literally made a perfect line. You know, and that wasn't something I was trying to do. It's just that, you know, habit over reason every time. That's what I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of it is practice, but some of it is, when in doubt, go under, because people will always tell you they need more. They will never tell you they need less. And so that's where I try to go as minimal as possible and let people pull me this way. So that's the other thing, is probably over err on less.
So this question is a bit, I don't know if it's a bit specific or if you would deal with this much. In my daily work, I create dashboards intended for automation, right? So, you know, there's different categories, discrete dimensions of things that they want to color by to separate. And because it's automated, you know, the system of record creates new discrete dimensions all on their own. And Tableau will, at best, auto-assign a color. At worst, make them all the same color.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, do you have any tricks or advice on some way to make that a little easier to deal with or to work around that?
So one of the things I do is I really go back to how can I design this in black and white or grayscale? And so, I mean, some of it is really fighting. And I mean, especially I came initially, at one point I had some Six Sigma experience. And so I fought a lot with, you know, I know we want this, and I know we think, you know, that's Kanbaning it, but it's not really, because there is that overwhelm factor. And especially when colors don't have a semantic resonance, it actually creates cognitive fatigue. So the more color assault you throw at somebody, that becomes a decision, and they have to parse through it. There is a cultural bias. Some people can do it better than others. Americans are absolutely lousy at it. So, you know, typically when you've got that much noise and that much clutter, there is a definite cultural bent where Americans really struggle with it.
Great
So
answer.
that's,
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Any related questions?
I had a quick question, and this is more of a clarification. First of all, great talk, enjoyed it a lot. Could you explain when you're talking about AA, AAA? I didn't quite get that concept or that slide either. Could you explain what that means?
I can totally explain what that means. So when we get into web content guidelines, they've got just a kind of a target between your contrast. So you're going to take your darkest color against your lightest color. And so if I put text here, so I wrote nope here, and that's just because these two grays do not meet compliance. So when I go and I test it, you can see here the contrast here is low. It tells me it's, just under what I want it to be. And so, if I'm going for AA, it's not nearly as stringent. And so what they're doing is calculating the visual distance between this dark shade to this light shade. So the ratio is 4.5. And so that's kind of that contrast ratio. The ideal, particularly when dealing with text that people have to read and be responsible for, I mean, you think about aging populations, you think about the variances in our screens, that AAA is really the ideal. And so what that does is it really elevates that contrast ratio. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Last call for questions.
Yeah, I had a question. I was asking what was down tuning. Like conceptually, what are you doing from a math standpoint when you down tune?
So conceptually what I'm doing is every color, think of color as like a flashlight, or it's putting out a certain amount of light. So these are really bright colors. And so what I want them to do is on this color wheel, I want them to be kind of at the same position. So I want to make sure it's not too far in or too far out. I really want it in that sweet spot of where it falls in the color wheel. And so that's a bit of that balance. But then if I see that, these are bright. And so these are great on a dark background. They're harsh on a white background. Like if I put this on white, it would be painful. And that's just because the assault of bright colors. As is, it's on a dark background and it's still fairly combative. This one's a little bit more calmer, and so that's where you push it back a bit, where you can take it down with transparency, you can take it down the brightness effect. One good test is phones in particular are almost violent with the amount of light that they put out. So if you kind of look at it with your phone and see kind of where the bright spots are, that's another way to manage your color. And then, depending on your screen, so Macs tend to be very bright. I've got a Surface and it can be very bright versus some of your other monitors are not nearly as bright. Is that helpful?
Yeah, Michael,
Yes, thanks.
got in. All right, well, thanks everyone, especially Bridget, for presenting and sharing all that there is to, maybe not all that there is to know, but so much that there is to know about color.
There's definitely a lot there. And then, again, this is definitely a topic I'm exploring a fair amount on my blog as well. So, tableaufit.com, I've got a tag for color. So things like the Stroopify are covered. I've got other things out there as far as like mixed signals and then some color tips. So, all of this is also out here. So especially if you're going through and going, I can't keep up, or, I've got these different bits out on the blog that I periodically put out.
Great. I put the URL in the chat.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. All right, well, Bridget, thank you. Applause, virtual applause. Barely not even satisfying virtual applause. But it's very appreciative. You did a great job, both technically and professionally. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did as well.
Thank you very much. And then at some point, maybe in the distant future, you are only a drive down. So, that is also a possibility in the very distant future.
Well, yeah, when we meet in person, we'd love to have you and share pizza and talk shop.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you so much.